on it is producing much higher levels of protection for the rights of the individual. Also for organisations using big data, making sure that they are doing that in the way that protects their users, and much bigger fines for misuse, much more obligation to prove that you're taking positive action to protect data. And actually, I think what's happened is that over the last 5 to 10 years, technology has moved on really, really fast, and legislation hasn't caught up with it. And the GDPR is really an attempt to catch the legislation, to catch up with what's been going on with technology and the internet and things like that. It's the 1st of May where it all becomes legal. I think it's unlikely that on the 2nd of May you'll get a request from an auditor from the Information Commissioner's Office asking you to prove what you've done. But really you need to be taking positive steps now, because theoretically that could happen, even though I don't suppose you're likely to be the higher priority in terms of their attention. Does it affect you? Basically the answer is going to be yes. If you've got a computer, if you've got CCTV, if you store data, let alone share it with maybe a vicar, you're going to be covered by it. So I think you just have to assume that to be the case. There's certain additional rules and regulations for very large organisations or for people dealing with very sensitive data, but basically you're going to be covered by the rules, along with pretty much every organisation and company in the UK. So what are the key elements? I like to call it complicated common sense, because if you take a look at the legislation and the rules and the clauses, lawyers would love it. There's so much there, but underlying it, there is a lot of common sense. And there's a number of principles that really underpin these new legislation. Privacy by design basically means whenever you're building a process or doing something, you should always have privacy in mind. So if you're creating a system to file things away, thinking about who has access to these files, how long are you going to keep these files for, are you going to share these files with anyone else? So always thinking about privacy in everything you do with any of your business processes. Consent is all about strengthening the consents for individuals whose data you've got. And what they're saying now is that all consent must be freely given and very unambiguous. And maybe an example of this is you couldn't tie in, let's say, signing up with your service to somebody having to accept being on a marketing list with you. If you want to market to them, there's got to be a very specific, separate request for somebody to give consent for you to market with them. You can't tie it into something else. So freely. As I mentioned, much more individual rights. So for example, the right to be forgotten, or if you've got any of their data incorrect, you have to rectify it. You can't keep incorrect data. And as well as this, you've got to prove that you're doing things correctly. Under the Data Protection Act, as long as you'd registered with the Information Commissioner's Office, it showed really that you were aware and dealing with data seriously. Now you've got to prove if you get an audit, and really that means policies, privacy notices, showing that you're taking it seriously and building it into your systems at your workplace. Data storage is a principle that really you should only keep information that's necessary and no longer than necessary. So one question about whether it's covering non-electronic records as well as for electronic. And Claire, who's from Much Loved and is very averse with all the rules and regulations, has been helping us in-house. She's coming in as well with some of these technical responses. And yeah, unfortunately, it covers both electronic and non-electronic. The last thing to mention here is marketing, in that marketing is pretty complicated, and I'll come to that at the end, but there are some specific rules and regulations when you want to send information to both families and people on your database. Before moving on, some of you, and I've looked around some of your privacy notices, some of you still ask for the £10 to get personal details. That's now gone. If people want to see what personal details you store with them, you have to give them that information. You can't charge them for it. One little bit of good news is this legislation just relates to the living, not the dead. So all the information about the deceased isn't covered by the GDPR. So that's the key elements. I just want to spend a couple of minutes on how charities are responding. You may remember the Olive Cook scandal. She was the pensioner, the poppy seller, and she was receiving well, she was being bombarded with requests from multiple charities for money, and she committed suicide. And it transpired that many charities have been basically sharing or selling data about their supporter base with other charities, and they were sending them all sorts of different marketing asks. This caused absolutely loads of bad publicity, and charities have been massively changing their systems to make sure they get their house in order. And on top of that, there's a new fundraising regulator for the charity system who's keeping a real eye on things. I think from your point of view, that the important factor is that if you give charities data, and that this may be your next of kin client or the funeral donors, you can be absolutely confident that that data is only going to be used in order to thank for the donation. It's not going to be shared or used for any other purpose without specific charity consent. Those days have gone, and this is one of the reasons why GDPR is a very good thing, and that people can't misuse data without massive fines. Following on from that, I don't know if you've received any information from charities on a personal point of view over the last few months. I'm actually a supporter of Bowel Cancer UK, and I've just put here a slide which is a letter I got from them a month or so ago, basically asking me whether I was happy to stay on their database and receive information about research, campaigns and raising funds, and I could opt in to all sorts of different bits of information. This is because charities are wanting to make sure that the consent that they've got is clear, freely given and unambiguous, because, as I mentioned, the rules have got so much tougher with GDPR. A lot of the charities are concerned that the consent they received in the past may not be up to scratch, so they're actually sending out letters updating the consent and making sure it's clear and it's opt-in rather than opt-out. There's lots of different approaches to what's going on. The legislation is not particularly prescriptive. It's open to interpretation, which is good in a way because all sorts of businesses are very different. But it does mean that sometimes you might want to get some advice to make sure you're doing things in a fair and available way. And if I could just mention SAIF at this point of view, they're going to make sure that they put together advice on this whole area, and I think that's really important because there's so much subjectivity that I think getting advice from SAIF will really protect you going forward. There's a question, is this a simple tick explicit consent? And a simple tick is important, but you've actually got to make it very clear what the data will then be used for. You can't just ask for people to tick to say, can we have your data? You need to say what it would be stored for. So that's a bit of information about how the charities are responding to these new rules. And in fact, because of the scandals they've had with people like Olive Cook, in the last 6 months, or even the last year, they're all doing all sorts of work to make sure they're compliant. And actually, I think this is one of the reasons that SAIF wanted to really get this presentation going as a bit of a primer, because time is running out and it is important to put in place certain things before May. Coming back to the actual legislation and the wording, if you were to go to one place to read more about it, I would say it's the ICO website. ICO stands for the Information Commissioner's Office, ico.org.uk. They've actually got some small business enterprise help guides and some good general checklists to do with GDPR. So it's a great place to go. But what I'm trying to do here in this presentation is maybe focus in one or two things that can give you a really good basic understanding of what you need to do for your business. The most important thing I can tell you is that you should be thinking always, what is the basis for you keeping or sharing data? What is the lawful basis for you doing this? And there's actually very specific reasons under the GDPR legislation. The first one is that you've been given consent by the data subject. So that's exactly what you saw in the last slide. If you actually give people a tick box, and it may be as part of the sign up, you say, can we do this for this reason, and they tick, you're getting their consent. So consent is one of the reasons that you can rely on. It's an important one. The second one would be performance of a contract. So actually with your family, they will have a contract with you for the funeral, and as long as those terms and conditions are very clear what you're going to do with their data and why, then you'll be completely covered, everything will be fine, because it's under this reason. You need to process their data to be able to carry out your duties under the contract. The third one, you will probably find you don't need compliance with a legal obligation, but the one example I can think about is maybe if you're collecting cash in terms of a donation and gift aid is being ticked, you may be legally obliged to pass over the address and postcode of the donor to the charity so that they can send that to HMRC to collect the gift aid. I.e., if you don't do that, HMRC can't collect the gift aid, so you're under a legal obligation to do so. D&E I'm not going to worry about because they shouldn't cover you. The last one is legitimate interests. This is a lawyer's dream because it's very, very broad in terms of subjectivity. What legitimate interest is trying to get to is explain that all businesses have to run their businesses, so they need to process data for that. So if it could be reasonably assumed that you're processing data for the reasonable purpose of forwarding on your business, then you probably have a legitimate interest for doing it. So that's what legitimate interest is all about. So before moving on, I just want to re-emphasize that whenever you process personal data, which will be normally your client, but it may be for donors during the funeral donations, you should be thinking about what is the lawful basis for doing that. And it may be you've been given consent, it may be that you need to perform your contract, or it may be that you feel you have a legitimate interest in doing so. So they're the things to bear in mind at all times. Now, what I'd quite like to do is actually to think about it in a practical world, some of the scenarios that you're going to come across, and then look to see under GDPR what basis you have in doing so. So talking about donations, there are 3 scenarios that I can think about where you may want to share personal data. And this will be the personal data normally of your client, it could be of the donor. So scenario 1 is passing on details of your client to the charity receiving donations. Number 2 is passing on details about the funeral donors to the charity. And the last one is actually passing on details of the donors back to your client. Now, I did a straw poll a few weeks ago and found that most funeral directors felt very comfortable passing on details of your client to the charity, but they didn't normally feel particularly comfortable passing on donor details, certainly not to the recipient charity or to the client. So we're just going to have a quick look and think about GDPR and whether that's something you can or can't do. In terms of passing on details of your client to the recipient charity, I think that's absolutely fine. I think you have a legitimate interest to do so because you've been tasked with doing this and you need to make sure that the charity has received the money and can report that back to the client. But I would recommend that maybe in your privacy notice, you actually say that you do this and you pass on the detail of the client to charity and why you do this. It's all about transparency. And actually, you might want to think about updating the terms and conditions of your contract with the client to say that if asked to process funeral donations, you will pass on their personal details to the charity so that they can thank you and offer them the opportunity to opt out if they want to. So that would certainly be what I think the best practice, to get it within your contract, and then your lawful basis is performance of contract. But even if you don't do that, I think you will have a legitimate business interest. You should maybe update your privacy notice so that there's clear transparency about that. So that's the first one, passing details of your client to the recipient charity. The second one is passing details of the funeral donors to the recipient charity. And actually, again, I think you can. I think in terms of transparency, it's quite an important thing so that the charity is able to confirm to the donor that they received the money and thank them for it. So I think you can say legitimate business interests. You won't be able to rely on any contract because you won't have a contract with the funeral donors. So I think you will be relying on legitimate interests. Likewise, you probably can't rely on consent because normally cash or checks come directly to you and you haven't had the opportunity to ask for consent. They just turned up through the post, through the door, or given to you at the funeral service. So you'll be relying on the lawful basis being legitimate interest, and I think that's absolutely fine. But here's where it gets maybe a bit more interesting, a bit more tricky. If you are thinking about passing on details of your donors back to your client, I think under GDPR, you shouldn't do that. Now, just to emphasize again, I'm not a lawyer. Obviously, we've had a look and made our decision based on the legislation as it's coming out. It's something that I know SAIF is looking at, but I don't think you can. And I think the main reason why is that you haven't got any consent from your donors normally to do that, and there's no contractual basis, and I don't think there's a legitimate interest, because you would then be really trumping the rights of privacy of your funeral donors to the rights of your client, and I don't see why your client should be prioritised. And as you can imagine, and as I think you all know, there'll be certain times when the donors will be absolutely not wanting your client to know their details. So I don't think you should do that. And I think furthermore, you do have to even think about passing on a list of names, because sometimes, whilst you may not give emails and postal addresses, you do give the names of your donors to your client. But under the legislation, names means that people can be personally identified, so it is covered by the legislation. And it may be that you shouldn't even give the names of the donors to your client. Personally, I think it's crazy. Common sense means that you should, and hopefully common sense will prevail, but it's something you've got to be wary about. Remember, coming back to online donations, if you do go the online donation route, you can allow consent to be obtained at the time of donors giving a donation, and this gets rid of all these problems, because if they don't give consent, information isn't passed across either to the charity or to the family. So online donations does help because it enables that consent to be given or not. So just moving on to maybe another scenario you might come across. You may have to give details of your client to a vicar, to a celebrant, so they can make contact. And you might wonder, is this going to be a problem now? We've had a little look into this, and we're pretty sure that you have absolutely the right to do that, because under legitimate interests, you need to pass on the details to vicars or celebrants and other people getting involved with the funeral. Coming back to the terms and conditions of the contract, it might be a good idea, however, to add that in to your terms and conditions with your client, to say explicitly that you will pass on details, their contact details, to anybody such as the vicar and the celebrant, so they can make contact to make sure that they can do their part of the funeral. That's, in a sense, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but you can rely on legitimate business interests otherwise. However, if you get somebody coming into your front door saying, I want to give a donation, or I can see you're doing the funeral for so-and-so, I'm an old friend or I'm a colleague, I'd like to get in contact with them, can you give me their details? Absolutely no way. Really important then. There's no legitimate business interest for doing that. You haven't had consent. There's no contractual right to do that. And that's the sort of scenario I would worry, because it only takes one complaint to really damage your reputation if you're accused of passing personal details of your client to people where you shouldn't do that. So that's something to be really taking very seriously, and training of staff may be very important here as well. So hopefully I've just talked about you really thinking about the lawful basis for sharing data, and then looking about some of the scenarios you have, a lot of them relating to donations, but also sharing information with other people. Just got a couple more slides to go now. I'm only going to talk about marketing for a minute or so, because it is very complicated, and I don't think it will be beneficial to spend too much time here today. I think the first thing to think about is that if you do have a computer database of people that you want to send marketing literature to, you've really got to learn a little bit more about GDPR before sending them things after May. And actually, you may need to think about it before then, because you may need to refresh your consent from people on your database before May, and actually make sure that you've got clear opt-in consent before you carry on sending them details. Remember the lawful basis. It should always be either consent or legitimate interest. And I think there was a question earlier about electronic as opposed to non-electronic communication. There's a very big difference when it comes to marketing between post and phone, non-electronic, and sending emails or SMS texts, electronic communications. There's going to be specific additional legislation relating to electronic communications. It basically makes it a lot stricter if you want to send emails and SMS text. You will have to have very specific opt-in consent. Whereas actually for postal, sending leaflets and so on is a much better scenario. You'll be able to send post as long as you're making sure there's a clear facility for people to opt out, so that anytime they want to, they can say to you, stop sending me post. That's going to be the crucial thing there. So you have to think the difference between electronic and non-electronic. And if you're doing electronic, you're going to make sure it's going to have opt-in specific consent. Otherwise, you can't do it after May. Whereas for post, just make sure you're allowing people to opt out. The last thing I just want to end with is maybe a few practical suggestions to get you up and running. It's maybe not what you want to be thinking about when you've probably got hundreds of Christmas cards and presents and stockings to fill, but 5 or 6 things, which some of them aren't too difficult, to make sure you're clicking off a few things before May. The first one is probably the simplest. Register with the ICO. I've got the website up there, ico.org.uk. If you've got a computer in your office, you've almost certainly got to register. It is £35 a year. It's another annoying cost, but it is a very important thing to show that you've actually complying with the legislation and you're taking it very, very seriously. So get registered. Secondly, you should probably start to think about all the processes you have in the office and start to put together policies, particularly in terms of paper records, record retention, making sure you have a policy if somebody says, I want my details to be taken off the database, that sort of thing. And actually the next one I think is a really important thing anyway. Computers and IT is becoming very, very important, and it can cause you big problems if an issue comes up. So things like leaving computers unattended, making sure you've got good passwords, that people keep their own personal passwords, is really important. So think about maybe having some internal privacy training and then record that you've done it. Again, this comes back to accountability, proving that you're looking to protect people's data. You're not paying lip service. So maybe think about just some basic, Friday mornings, thinking about privacy and making sure your staff know what they should be doing. And remember what I mentioned about not passing details of clients to people who just walk in through the door. Even if they are quite clearly a friend or family, you shouldn't pass any personal details across. That sort of training. The next one is maybe think about your privacy notice. You may have one already. If you don't, get a privacy notice created, put it on your website. It doesn't have to be perfect now. You can continue to build and improve it over the months to come. But the privacy notice is all about transparency and showing what you do with people's data, whether or not you pass it on to the charities, whether or not you keep cookies on your computer. So the best thing I would actually do is have a look around at other people's and look at their privacy notices, and then use that to build your own and badger SAIF, because I think SAIF hopefully as well is going to give you some advice here in making sure you've got a really good, clear privacy notice. And lastly, if you're going to be doing marketing, you need to spend a bit of time making sure you understand the rules. So if you're sending marketing beyond May, to make sure you can't be accused of not being compliant with the new legislation. So that's pretty much there. Thank you ever so much. I'm going to have a little look down. If anyone's got any particular questions now. I think there was one question saying that if on the terms and conditions to state that data will only be used for legitimate business purposes, would that be adequate to meet consent requirements? The answer is no, because they're two very specific things. You've either got to be relying on legitimate business interest or reliant on consent. So you either have to be asking people to tick to give consent with a very, very clear opt-in message, or you're relying on legitimate business interest. You don't actually want to mix them together. That would get into a muddle and wouldn't be right. I've got a question about how can I download the presentation. I'll pass it over to Claire and Angela at SAIF, because I think they got the names of everybody coming along to today's presentation, and we'll have your email addresses, and hopefully they'll email it across to all of you or give you a link to an online resource where you can get to it and download it yourselves. Likewise, if you've got any specific questions, as well as carrying on putting them down here, you can email us at muchloved. I'm jonathan.davis@muchloved.com. Claire is claire.holt@muchloved.com, but probably the easier one to remember is support@muchloved.com, and I'll just make sure that's down now. So I've just put up there a couple of email addresses. If people have got any particular personal questions about GDPR and the legislation, or need to head off now and don't have time to stay online, by all means, just ask us a question. We've got a couple of email addresses there. I think a very interesting question just come up about online reviews. I think if you're collecting people's online reviews, or more to the point, if you're collecting people's reviews and testimonies and putting them online, I think you've got to be very wary about putting their name without permission, because their name is seen as a personal identification factor in terms of personal data. So I think you'll need to ask their permission if you're going to put their name up on your website. It may be fine just to put the comments such as, so-and-so funeral director did a fantastic job, but as soon as you put from John and Susan in Great Yarmouth, I think you're on slippery ground or thin ice with today's weather in mind, if you actually put that on without their consent. Somebody's asking about other questions and so on. We'll certainly have a look through, and we can put together an email which we can send to Angela and Claire at SAIF about any questions and answers that they can share with others. If people put the review on Facebook, that's an interesting one. If they've given their name and details on Facebook already, I don't think you'll have a problem about replicating that on your website, but that's an interesting one, and probably would want to check before saying definitively the answer. Hopefully that's been a helpful presentation for everyone. I saw in the notes that a lot of you, I think the GDPR is the key important thing, and so maybe that was the reason for coming for the presentation. So I'll take those comments on board, and maybe we can redo this seminar for people, and there's others in the organisation that want to see it, but maybe strip out all the donation and just have a 20-minute session on GDPR and the rules. And if people want to find out about the change in funeral donations, that can be done as a completely separate webinar. Leslie has put in a question which I really like, because it shows really that you're between a rock and a hard place sometimes. She writes that you've always given available information pertaining to donors' charitable donations to next of kin as being open and transparent. This is the information they have given us. I'm completely with you on that, and I think transparency and openness is very important. It's actually part of the GDPR legislation, but there is a real problem in that your donors, even if they give you their personal information, you don't have the right to share it with others unless you're relying on consent or legitimate business interests. And you may be able to get consent, but that will be complete admin hellhole. So you're probably only going to have to rely on legitimate business interests. And I'm not sure if you can claim that, because the donations are being made to the charity. Your family, the next of kin, aren't directly involved in the transaction. The money's going from the donor to the charity. And so you're making the assumption that the donor will want their information to go across to the family, and that's an assumption. That's the problem, which is why I think we have to make the recommendation that you don't do it, even though it's going to cause you some frustration. And I think that's something I'll pass on to SAIF, because maybe they can look to get more advice, and maybe you'll be able to get some dispensation to do that based on common sense and transparency. Okay, I'm just thinking if there's any more questions coming in. Yeah, I think most people are going now. I'll stay online for another couple of minutes just in case there's any other questions. Otherwise, thank you ever so much. Please do feedback to Angela and Claire. I can do this webinar again for others if people want it. So just let them know if it's something that you think would be of benefit. Thank you ever so much.